Owen Miller had never planned to become the last relic of a neighborhood that once belonged to quiet craftsmen and stubborn families who built things to last. His barn stood as the final witness of that era, a broad, time-worn structure with deep chestnut beams and a roof patched by his father's hands decades ago. It was not merely a storage space, but a personal archive of the life he had built. Canvases coated with dust, half-finished sculptures, mechanical contraptions, and the faint smell of oil and pine. To Owen, the building breathed in its own rhythm, creaking when the weather changed, humming faintly when the wind pushed through its rafters. It had survived storms, termites, and years of neglect from the outside world, but it could not survive the arrival of what the new residents called progress. The Homeowners Association had moved in slowly, like a polite disease, buying up parcels of land, painting every mailbox the same color, installing ornamental lamps that looked like replicas of an imagined past. What used to be the edge of town became a planned community, complete with glossy brochures and a logo that made it seem as though beauty could be voted into existence. The barn, sitting on the border of this reborn paradise, became their obsession. At first, Owen received letters that seemed almost apologetic, requests to consider a repainting, then recommendations for aesthetic alignment, and finally, formal notifications about non-compliant structures. Each document arrived on heavy, cream-colored paper with embossed headers and the same cold signature at the bottom. Nadine Sutter, HOA President. He kept them all in a shoebox near the window, unopened after the third one. The barn was private property. It was his father's legacy and his own workspace, a place where no rule book or committee had any right to intrude. But the new neighbors didn't see history in weathered wood. They saw risk, insurance liabilities, and declining property values. When Owen painted in the evenings, he could sometimes feel their eyes from the street, lingering, judging, counting the days until they could find a reason to take what he refused to sell. Still, he remained calm, distant, and polite in his refusals. He even attended one HOA meeting out of curiosity, standing in the back of a pristine hall that smelled faintly of sanitizer and artificial lemon. They spoke in rehearsed tones about community harmony and visual cohesion. A photo of his barn appeared on the projector screen like an autopsy exhibit. Someone called it an unfortunate exception to our shared vision. He said nothing, only watched their polished shoes tapping impatiently, as if waiting for him to break. When the meeting ended, Nadine approached him with a smile so measured it looked painful. She told him the association wanted to help him modernize his property, maybe even repurpose the barn into something useful. A yoga center, perhaps. He smiled back, but his eyes didn't match the gesture. "It's already useful," he said. "It's mine." That night, when he returned home, the barn looked even older under the moonlight, and for a moment he felt the quiet dread of inevitability. Progress was coming for him the way it came for everything old, patiently, legally, and without a conscience. The next morning, a new letter arrived. This one wasn't printed on the usual stationery. It was stamped with red ink and carried only a few words. Final notice. Structure to be removed under community safety regulations. He read it twice, folded it, and slid it into the shoebox with the others. Then he sat on the barn's wooden floor and listened to the faint ticking of the roof settling above him. Somewhere in the distance, a truck engine growled. It was the kind of sound that meant someone was preparing to act, and he knew instinctively. It was no longer a matter of if, but when. The sound came before the reason, a deep, metallic groan that didn't belong in the stillness of the morning. Owen awoke to the vibration of the windows, that strange pulse in the glass that told him heavy machinery was nearby. For a few seconds, his half-dreaming mind tried to make sense of it. Perhaps roadwork or a delivery truck turning around, until the unmistakable echo of a hydraulic crane tore through the fog. When he stepped outside, barefoot and disoriented, the sky was a pale, indifferent gray, and the air reeked of diesel. At the edge of his property, where the grass met the paved service road, a yellow crane stood like a metal animal stretching its neck toward his barn. 2 construction trucks idled beside it, their drivers talking to a group of men in reflective vests. The letters HOA were printed neatly on a white trailer parked nearby, as if it were a mobile office for destruction. He didn't shout right away. For a moment, he simply watched in disbelief, trying to fit the scene into logic. His barn wasn't condemned. There had been no court order, no inspection, no signature from the city, but the rhythm of the morning left no room for sanity. A man in a hard hat waved toward the crane operator, and the heavy chain attached to the main beam tightened with a slow, ominous creak. Owen moved before he realized it, running across the yard, the wet grass cold under his feet. His voice finally broke the mechanical symphony. Sharp, human, full of alarm. "Stop! What the hell are you doing? This is private property." The men turned, startled for only a second, then settled back into a posture of bureaucratic confidence. The one with the clipboard, a tall man with a weary face and cautious politeness, raised a hand. "Sir, we have authorization from the Homeowners Association to remove an unsafe structure. You've received multiple notices." Owen stopped a few feet away, chest heaving. "Notices aren't orders," he said. "You can't demolish a building without legal approval." The man's expression remained neutral, but his eyes flickered toward the crane, then back to Owen, as if this conversation was something he'd practiced for. "We're following procedure," he said. "Any objections should be filed in writing." That phrase, filed in writing, landed like a slap. Bureaucracy had replaced reason. Before Owen could respond, the crane began to move. The groan of strained metal filled the air, and the chain pulled tight against the frame of the barn. The old wood, which had survived half a century of storms, let out a sound that was not quite cracking and not quite screaming. The noise was almost alive, a protest in timber and rust. "Stop!" Owen shouted again, running closer, but 2 workers stepped in front of him. One of them, a woman with a tired, sunburned face, shook her head. "Back up, sir. It's not safe." The irony struck him like static. "It's not safe," the phrase they used to justify this violation. He backed away only because he knew the structure could collapse at any moment if they pulled wrong. The air felt heavy, charged, as though the whole yard were holding its breath. Then the mistake happened. The crane operator, impatient or careless, adjusted the angle of the arm too quickly. The chain slipped, and the massive hook struck the corner beam. In an instant, the entire right side of the barn lurched. A hollow thunder rolled out as the roof folded inward, sending a cloud of dust and splinters across the field. The workers ducked, shouting, but it was too late to control the fall. Owen turned instinctively, shielding his face as the air exploded with fragments of wood. The structure didn't collapse where they expected it to. Instead of falling forward toward the open space, the left half of the barn twisted backward, pulled by the counterweight of the crane's tension. It buckled like an enormous joint bending the wrong way. The beam snapped, and gravity did the rest. The barn fell sideways, directly onto the adjacent lot. The new clubhouse, half-built and wrapped in plastic banners boasting "Coming Spring 2026, stood no chance. The heavy roof of the barn crushed through its upper frame, shredding insulation and steel supports like paper. The sound was both magnificent and terrible, a roar that swallowed every other noise. When the dust began to settle, a section of the crane's arm was bent, the clubhouse roof was gone, and the banner that had once displayed a smiling family now hung torn in the wreckage, its slogan, "A place for community and comfort," barely readable under the dirt. Owen stood motionless. His throat burned from the dust and his heart from disbelief. No one spoke for several seconds. Even the machines seemed stunned. The man with the clipboard finally broke the silence, his voice trembling. "Jesus Christ, call it in. Shut it down." Someone ran toward the trailer, shouting into a radio. Another worker sat on the ground, clutching his helmet like a child. Owen felt a strange calm spreading through him, that cold numbness that replaces fear when the worst has already happened. He looked at the ruined barn, the place where his father had taught him how to carve wood, the place he thought he could keep untouched, now reduced to wreckage tangled with the very symbol of the HOA's pride. It was grotesquely poetic. Nadine Sutter arrived minutes later, stepping out of a black SUV with the sharp precision of someone who believed in her own authority. She took in the sight before her with an expression that flickered between disbelief and rage. Her voice, when it came, was low and steady. "Mr. Miller," she said, "you've just destroyed community property. You'll be hearing from our attorneys." Owen turned his gaze toward her, eyes rimmed with red dust, and replied with a voice so quiet it cut through her composure. "No, you destroyed mine first." Behind him, a single piece of the barn's metal hinge swung loosely from the crane's chain, tapping against the side with a hollow, rhythmic clink, like the slow toll of a bell marking the end of something that had lasted too long to die quietly. The workers began to disperse, sirens wailing in the distance as if summoned by inevitability. The morning that had started with the sound of construction ended in collapse, and though Owen did not know it yet, that fall had shifted something much deeper than wood or concrete. It had broken the illusion that control belonged to those who claimed it by rule, rather than by right. By the next morning, the neighborhood had turned into a silent crime scene without the yellow tape. The air still smelled of dust and burnt oil, and Owen's yard bore the marks of panic, the deep tire tracks of fleeing trucks, the splintered boards that had once been the heart of his barn. The HOA's precious clubhouse looked like the ghost of a construction site after an earthquake. Its skeletal frame leaned against the wreckage of the barn's beams, the whole thing shrouded in torn insulation that fluttered faintly in the breeze. From his porch, Owen could see the workers standing in clusters, whispering, waiting for someone in authority to tell them what story to tell. At 9 o'clock sharp, Nadine Sutter returned, no longer in her tailored beige suit, but in black slacks and a crisp blouse, as if mourning something that only she believed had value. She was flanked by two men in matching jackets, the HOA's legal consultants, both of whom carried folders and expressions of self-importance. They approached without a greeting. One of them began speaking before Owen could open his mouth. "Mr. Miller, under community ordinance and contractual regulation, you're liable for the destruction of shared property and for obstructing lawful removal procedures." His tone was so smooth, so perfectly bureaucratic, that it almost masked the absurdity of his words. Owen stared at him for a moment, then said quietly, "You broke into my land. You tore down my building. You didn't have a single document from the city authorizing it." The man didn't flinch. "The association had internal clearance, sir. The barn was reported as a safety hazard. You ignored multiple notices." "And you ignored the law," Owen replied. His voice was steady now, not loud, but dangerous in its calm. Nadine stepped forward, her perfume sharp even in the wind. "This isn't about law," she said. "It's about accountability. People could have been killed." Her gaze drifted toward the wreckage of the clubhouse, as though it were a monument to her wounded pride. Owen almost laughed. "You mean your project could have been delayed? You didn't care if my building was dangerous. You cared that it didn't fit your brochure." For a brief second, her eyes betrayed her. That flicker of annoyance, that recognition of truth she refused to speak aloud. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar mask of control. "Expect a lawsuit," she said, turning to leave. "You'll have your chance to defend yourself, though I can't imagine what you'll say." As they walked away, Owen noticed that one of the consultants lingered a moment longer than the others. The man's hands trembled as he closed his folder. "For what it's worth," he muttered, not looking up. "The crane shouldn't have been used on uneven ground. Someone from their side overrode the safety lockout." Then he followed Nadine back to her SUV, leaving Owen standing in the settling dust. That night, sleep didn't come. He sat in the remains of what used to be the barn, surrounded by debris that no longer had a shape or purpose. The stars above looked strangely foreign without the silhouette of the roof cutting across them. He thought about what the man had said, about the lockout override, and something inside him shifted. Not just grief, but curiosity sharpened into purpose. He needed proof. The next morning he drove to the county's Building and Development Office, a squat brick structure that smelled of toner and old carpet. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with the expression of someone who'd seen every form of absurdity pass through her counter, listened patiently as he explained the situation. When he mentioned the HOA, her eyebrows arched slightly. "They've been filing a lot of requests lately," she said, typing into her computer. "Mostly construction approvals. Let's see. Here it is. Clubhouse expansion permit, filed under their development subsidiary, Sutter and Finch Properties." "Subsidiary," Owen repeated. "That's not an association, then. That's a company." "Technically," she said, lowering her voice, "they registered it as a development partnership, but they list HOA members as signatories to get around zoning restrictions." She turned the monitor slightly toward him. "This right here. That's not a public structure. It's private real estate under the HOA's ownership. Your land sits on the only remaining easement connecting their property to the access road." Owen stared at the screen, trying to process it. "So they built their clubhouse on land they don't legally have access to?" "Pretty much," she said. "If they'd filed for an easement adjustment, you'd have been notified. But I'm not seeing any record of that." She printed a few pages and slid them across the counter. "Take these copies. You'll need them." The drive home felt unreal. Every familiar street now looked like part of some elaborate fraud, every decorative mailbox and manicured hedge concealing the machinery of quiet theft. When he arrived, the site was cordoned off with plastic fencing and a bold red sign that read, "Danger. Restricted Area, HOA, Authorized Personnel Only." His own property, branded like a corporate asset. He walked past the sign anyway, ignoring the warnings. Inside the wreckage, the crane still stood, immobile, its yellow arm bent and its engine silent. He climbed onto the base, brushing away the dirt and shattered glass. There, near the hydraulic controls, was a strip of tape with numbers scrawled in permanent marker, an override code. He took a photo of it with his phone, his pulse steady but fast, the first clear sense of direction he'd felt since the collapse. They had broken the rules of safety to speed up their demolition. That made them not just reckless, but criminally negligent. He knew he couldn't fight them with emotion. He'd have to fight them with evidence, with patience, with the same calm cruelty they used against everyone else. By the time the sun set, the crane's shadow stretched across the ruins of the clubhouse like a scar on the land. Somewhere inside him, the first ember of defiance began to burn. Not loud, not dramatic, but certain. They thought they could bury him under bureaucracy and blame, but they had just given him something far more powerful than outrage, a reason to uncover every secret they'd tried to hide. The fourth week after the collapse arrived quietly, as though the neighborhood had decided that silence was its preferred method of control. The reconstruction site across the property line was still a ruin, but the HOA had replaced the torn banners with new ones that read, "Rebuilding Together," in bold, hopeful lettering. It was the kind of phrase that sounded wholesome until you realized it meant rebuilding on your land, without your consent. Owen had stopped arguing with anyone from the association. He no longer answered their calls or opened their envelopes. The letters kept arriving, more formal, more threatening, written in that sterile legal tone designed to suffocate ordinary language. He let them pile up on the kitchen table until they formed a stack thick enough to be mistaken for a phone book. At night, he sat by the broken remains of the barn, staring at the foundation stones still anchored in the soil. They reminded him of teeth, rooted, stubborn, incapable of being truly erased. One evening, as dusk turned the world into blue glass, a car's headlights appeared at the end of his drive. The vehicle stopped before the fencing, and a woman stepped out, her shoes crunching the gravel. She was around his age, maybe younger, her hair tied back in a precise knot. She introduced herself as Julia Singer, a property rights attorney. She didn't smile when she spoke. She simply said, "You need representation, Mr. Miller. They've filed for damages exceeding $500,000. He wanted to send her away, to tell her he didn't need another professional voice explaining how impossible the situation was, but there was something about her tone, quiet, measured, without sympathy but full of understanding, that made him hesitate. He led her into the kitchen and offered coffee, though neither of them drank it. Julia spread out the documents she'd brought, copies of the HOA's filings, aerial maps, and a recent appraisal claiming that the loss of the clubhouse had reduced community property value by 11%. "They're building a narrative," she said, her finger tapping the margin of the page. "Unsafe barn, negligent owner, refusal to comply. It's clean, organized, and dangerous because it reads well." Owen looked at the paper, the bold lines and legal citations. Can they actually win? Julia shrugged slightly. They could. The HOA's power lies in the fact that it acts like a government without being one. No checks, no balances, just contracts that most people sign without reading. But, she paused, flipping to another sheet, they made a critical mistake. She slid the document toward him. It was a building permit for the new clubhouse. He recognized Nadine's signature, the precise slant of her handwriting, but beneath it was a second signature that froze him. George F. Miller, his father, dated 2 years after the man had died. "They forged this?" he asked quietly, his voice barely carrying the words. "Or reused an old scan," Julia said. "Either way, it's fraud. And if they used this to secure construction approval, the entire project was illegal from the start." The room seemed to tilt slightly as he absorbed it. His father, who had fought for every inch of their property, now being used as a puppet in paperwork designed to erase that fight. Julia continued, her tone steady but low. "I've handled cases like this. Associations sometimes acquire land through redevelopment loopholes, then falsify consent from adjacent owners to expedite zoning. Your father's name gave them leverage. They made it appear as if the family had agreed to grant right-of-way access for the new build." She looked up. "It explains why they were so desperate to demolish your barn. It stood partly on that disputed line. Keeping it there was a reminder that the land was never theirs." Owen leaned back, pressing his palms against the edge of the table. His thoughts came in waves: anger, grief, the hollow laughter of disbelief. "So they buried the evidence under the pretense of safety." Julia nodded. "And when it went wrong, they turned the story against you." They spent hours going through documents, tracing inconsistencies like cracks in glass. Every file Julia pulled revealed another layer of deception. Insurance claims filed before the collapse, maintenance costs inflated to justify budget expansions, a shell company registered to Nadine's cousin that handled construction oversight. It was a web so carefully built that most people would have missed the pattern, but once seen, it couldn't be unseen. When Julia finally left that night, the table was covered in papers, and the air smelled faintly of burnt coffee. Before she walked out, she turned to him and said, "You don't have to destroy them in court. You just have to show the truth. Bureaucracy only wins when no one looks too closely." After she drove away, Owen stepped outside. The air was cold and the moon hung low over the wreckage. He walked to the barn's foundation and knelt beside one of the stones. Embedded in the dirt, half hidden beneath the debris, was a brass plaque his father had installed decades ago, long before the HOA even existed. The inscription was simple: "For those who build things to last." He brushed the dirt away until the letters shone faintly in the moonlight. The next morning, he drove to the county records office again. He spent the entire day there, requesting archives, permits, transaction histories. The clerks watched him with mild curiosity, but no one stopped him. By late afternoon, he found what he needed: a zoning map from 20 years earlier, showing the original parcel divisions. The line separating his property from the newly claimed HOA land was clear, running directly beneath what had become the foundation of their clubhouse. His father's handwriting was still visible in the margin, a note written in fading blue ink: "Boundary confirmed. Private. Do not sell." Owen made copies of everything and brought them home, spreading them across the floor like puzzle pieces. As the light faded, he realized how simple the truth really was. The HOA's empire of order, aesthetics, and control was built on a stolen line, a false assumption that nobody would question the paperwork, because everyone feared being the one to stand against the collective. That night, thunder rolled in the distance, low and drawn out, the kind that made the air hum with static before rain. Owen didn't turn on the lights. He sat near the window, watching lightning illuminate the skeletal ruins outside. Every flash revealed something different: the twisted crane arm, the fallen banner, the reflection of his own face in the glass. He wasn't a fighter by nature, but something inside him had hardened into purpose. They had desecrated his father's name, rewritten the boundaries of truth itself, and now they expected him to play the role of the quiet, defeated man. He wasn't going to oblige. He picked up the phone and dialed Julia. When she answered, he said only one sentence: "If I can prove that signature was forged, can they lose the land?" She paused for a moment before replying, "They'll lose more than that. They'll lose their authority." After he hung up, the rain began to fall, slow, deliberate drops that hit the broken wood outside with the rhythm of inevitability. In that moment, he felt something he hadn't in weeks. Not hope exactly, but momentum. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one he was about to bring down on them, and for the first time, he welcomed it. The days that followed were a slow burn of tension, a quiet escalation that no one named aloud but everyone could feel, like static crawling through the air before lightning strikes. The HOA stopped pretending to play by its own rules. Where before there had been letters and veiled threats, now there was open hostility masked as procedure. Owen's mailbox overflowed daily with notices of violation, claims that his fence was too high, his lawn improperly maintained, his property a community hazard. It was a tactic of exhaustion, a bureaucratic siege meant to drown him in paperwork and fear. He no longer responded. He stacked the envelopes neatly in a corner of the kitchen, unopened, a monument to their desperation. Nadine Sutter, however, didn't disappear. She began to appear in person again, her SUV always parked in the same spot at the edge of the gravel road. Sometimes she would just sit there, windows up, pretending to check her phone, watching his house through the windshield. Other times, she brought 2 or 3 other members of the HOA board, staging impromptu property inspections that were nothing more than public humiliations. They'd stand outside his gate with clipboards, murmuring in soft tones like doctors discussing a terminal case. He ignored them until one afternoon, as he was repairing the barn's foundation stones, he heard laughter. When he looked up, 2 of the board members were taking photos of the wreckage, posing in front of it like tourists. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, expressionless, until they grew uncomfortable enough to leave. That night he sent the photographs Julia had collected, the forged signatures, the altered zoning maps, to the county auditor's office with a formal complaint attached. He didn't know whether they would act, but he knew silence was no longer an option. The following morning, someone had thrown a bucket of grey paint against his front door. It dripped down the wood in uneven streaks, thick and heavy, the colour of cement. No words, no threats, just that. A message that said, "We see you." He didn't clean it. He left it there like a scar. When Julia arrived later that day, she took one look at it and said, "They're nervous." She set her briefcase on the porch railing, exhaling slowly. "I spoke to the auditor's office. They've started a preliminary review. If they confirm the forgery, this could move fast." Owen nodded, though he didn't look relieved. "Fast isn't what worries me," he said quietly. "It's what they'll do before it's over." Julia studied him for a moment, her face unreadable. "Then we make it harder for them to act in the dark. I've arranged for an independent surveyor to verify your boundary line. He'll file the report directly with the county." The surveyor arrived 2 days later, a quiet man with a laser tripod, and the kind of patience only found in people used to dealing with property disputes. He worked from dawn until evening, marking the ground with orange flags, murmuring to himself as he measured and recalculated. When he finished, he handed Owen a sealed envelope and said, "Your father was meticulous. The line hasn't changed an inch. Whatever they built over it, it's on your land." That confirmation should have felt like victory. But Owen knew better. Bureaucracy didn't yield gracefully. It cornered, then retaliated. The retaliation came that weekend. Early Saturday morning, he woke to a grinding noise outside, a deep mechanical hum that vibrated through the walls. He stepped onto the porch and froze. A small construction crew was setting up scaffolding on the remains of the clubhouse, right where the property line cut through. The workers wore orange vests stamped with the logo of the same contractor listed in Julia's files, the one owned by Nadine's cousin. A fresh sign had been erected near the rubble. Community Rebuilding Project approved by HOA Council. The implication was clear. They were continuing construction, ignoring the legal dispute entirely. Owen walked toward the workers, calling out above the noise, "You're on private land. You can't build here." The foreman, a thick-set man with grey hair and a defensive stance, barely glanced up. "Take it up with the HOA," he said. "They're paying us. We just build." "You're trespassing," Owen insisted. The man shrugged. "Then call the cops." It was meant as mockery, not advice. The crane roared to life again, smaller than the one that had destroyed the barn but loud enough to make the ground tremble. Owen felt something in him snap, the quiet restraint he'd held for weeks, breaking under the weight of their arrogance. He turned away, walked back to the house, and called Julia. She didn't sound surprised. "They're trying to force a precedent," she said. "If they complete enough of the structure, they can argue it's an established improvement and harder to remove later. It's a calculated move. Don't confront them directly." "You think I'm afraid of them?" "I think they want you to be angry enough to make a mistake," she replied softly. "Let me handle it." But by the time she arrived, it was already dark. The workers had left for the evening, leaving behind floodlights that cast long shadows across the half-built framework. Owen stood in the yard staring at the border, his outline lit by that harsh, artificial glow. Julia walked up beside him and said, "The county investigator will be here Monday. Until then, document everything. Photos, videos, timestamps. We'll make them answer for every bolt they drive into your soil." He didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on something glinting in the dirt, a strip of metal embedded near the edge of the foundation. He crouched down and pulled it free. It was a surveyor's marker, but newer than the others, with the HOA's emblem stamped crudely into its side. They'd planted fake markers to make the property line appear shifted. He turned the piece over in his hands, the cold metal reflecting the floodlight. "They're not just lying on paper," he said. "They're rewriting the ground." Julia looked at him, her jaw tightening. "Then we'll show them the real map," she said. "But you need to understand, Owen, once this becomes public, it won't just be about your land. It'll expose every deal they've made here. They'll come after you with everything they have." He straightened slowly, the marker still clutched in his hand. "Let them," he said. "If they want to dig, I'll give them something worth finding." That night a storm rolled through again, wind rattling the scaffolding until it moaned like an animal in pain. The floodlights flickered, the shadows of the half-built structure stretching across his yard like reaching fingers. In the morning, when the storm cleared, one of the fake markers lay bent near his porch. Someone had thrown it there deliberately. It wasn't a threat this time. It was a warning that they knew he was getting close. And as he stood there, watching the light crawl over the wet debris, Owen realized that the battle had changed. It was no longer about saving what was his. It was about exposing what they had built their entire world on, the illusion of control, the myth of order, and the belief that truth could be buried under signatures and slogans. The courthouse smelled of old wood and rain, the kind of place where justice seemed to exist only in theory, until someone stubborn enough demanded to see it breathing. Owen sat beside Julia at the long wooden table, his palms flat, eyes steady, the stack of documents between them like a fragile fortress built from weeks of anger, loss, and endurance. Across the room, Nadine Sutter and the HOA's lawyer whispered behind perfectly arranged files, their composure sharp and deliberate, their smiles rehearsed. The judge, an older man with heavy eyes, adjusted his glasses and called the session to order. It began with the HOA's narrative, delivered like scripture, a story of a reckless property owner who refused to cooperate, whose decaying structure had endangered the community and caused catastrophic damage to shared property. Their lawyer spoke in the calm monotone of privilege, describing Owen's barn as a relic of negligence and his defiance as hostility. Each sentence was designed to suffocate nuance, to transform his grief into guilt. When they finished, Julia rose. She didn't raise her voice. Her strength was in the rhythm of her words, in the quiet precision that made every line impossible to ignore. She began with the forged permit, projecting it on the screen for all to see. The image of George Miller's signature filled the courtroom, the ink identical to that on a 20-year-old deed Owen had brought from his father's safe. "Mr. Miller's father passed away in 2017, Julia said, her voice like glass under pressure. Yet his consent was used in 2019 to authorize construction for the HOA's clubhouse. This isn't a clerical error. This is fraud." A murmur rippled through the room. Nadine's lawyer tried to object, but the judge raised a hand, signaling him to sit. Julia continued, revealing the web of shell companies, the duplicate property lines, the survey markers that contradicted official maps. Each page, each photograph, was another nail in the coffin of the association's story. Then she called the county surveyor as a witness. The man's calm testimony was devastating. He confirmed that the clubhouse's foundation extended 12 feet into Owen's parcel, that the demolition order for the barn had been issued without municipal authorization, and that the safety lockout on the crane had indeed been manually overridden. The HOA's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, flipping through his notes as though looking for a missing escape hatch. Nadine remained still, but her jaw tightened with every word. When Owen was asked to speak, he didn't read from notes. He simply stood and faced the judge. "That barn wasn't dangerous," he said quietly. "It was old. It was part of my family, built by hand when this land was nothing but open fields. They didn't tear it down because it was unsafe. They tore it down because it reminded them that something existed here before they did, something they couldn't control." His words lingered in the silence that followed, heavier than any evidence. The judge leaned back, his expression unreadable, then turned to Nadine. "Do you deny that your association used falsified documentation to obtain construction approval?" She hesitated, the first crack in her composure. "We acted under advisement," she said finally. "Our contractors handled the paperwork." Julia's eyes narrowed. "And the contractor happens to be your cousin." The courtroom tensed, a ripple of unease breaking through the last layer of the HOA's civility. Nadine's lawyer tried to intervene, but the damage was done. The judge called for a brief recess. Outside, in the hallway lined with portraits of forgotten officials, Julia exhaled for the first time that day. "He's seen enough," she said quietly. "They're finished." Owen nodded, though the weight in his chest didn't lift. It wasn't victory, he felt, just a slow release of something long coiled inside him. When court resumed, the ruling came swift and final. The demolition order was declared unlawful, the forged permit nullified, and the HOA's claim for damages dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, the judge ordered an injunction against any further development on the disputed land until a full audit could be completed by the county. As the gavel struck, the sound reverberated like thunder through the room. Nadine sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the tabletop, the image of control collapsing at last. Outside, rain had begun to fall again, a soft, steady curtain that turned the courthouse steps slick with reflection. Julia gathered her files, glancing at Owen. "You realize this isn't the end," she said. "They'll appeal, they'll spin it, they'll try to make you look like the villain again." Owen looked out at the wet sky and shook his head. "Let them. At least now they'll have to lie in daylight." As they walked to the car, he caught his reflection in a puddle, distorted by ripples, framed by the gray outlines of the courthouse behind him. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like a man defending something lost. He felt like a man who had survived the collapse and was still standing on solid ground. The storm was passing, and though the ruins would remain for a while, they no longer belonged to his grief. They were proof, undeniable, immutable, that truth could outlast even the most carefully built lies. The weeks after the trial unfolded in an uneasy calm, the kind that feels less like peace and more like the breath drawn between storms. The HOA's banners were gone now, stripped from their poles, leaving behind pale rectangles on the fences where sunlight hadn't touched for months. Construction on the ruined clubhouse never resumed. The site stood frozen in decay, half swallowed by weeds, the twisted steel reflecting morning light like bones under shallow water. Neighbors began to talk again, not to gossip, but to confess, one by one, that they had always suspected something was wrong. They stopped Owen on the road with awkward apologies, saying they hadn't understood what was happening, that they'd believed what they were told. He listened politely, accepting their words without judgment. It wasn't forgiveness they wanted. It was relief from their own silence. Nadine Sutter had resigned within a week of the ruling. The official story cited personal reasons, but the rumor was that county investigators had opened a file with her name on it. Her house stood dark at night now, the shades drawn, the once perfect hedges beginning to grow wild. The new interim HOA board sent Owen a letter written in a different tone, formal but cautious, almost deferential. They offered to discuss compensation for the damages, to make amends on behalf of the community. He didn't respond. Money couldn't rebuild what they destroyed, and reconciliation built on convenience was nothing more than the next version of control. Instead, he went back to work. Day by day, plank by plank, he began to rebuild the barn, not as a replica, but as a continuation. The new frame was steel instead of cedar, the walls lined with salvaged pieces from the wreckage. It wasn't beautiful yet, but it was honest. Sometimes Julia stopped by with coffee. Sometimes she didn't. She never asked how he was doing, and he never tried to explain. They shared the quiet understanding of people who had seen how easily order turns into tyranny when power wears a smile. On the first morning that the structure finally stood upright again, Owen climbed to the top beam and looked out across the land. The mist hung low over the fields, softening everything except the line of the old boundary, still visible, still his. From this height, the ruins of the clubhouse looked small, almost harmless. He took a piece of rusted metal from his pocket, the last fragment of the fallen crane, and fixed it to the highest beam. It caught the sunlight, glowing faintly like a muted flame. It wasn't a memorial. It was a reminder. Below, the new grass was beginning to grow through the cracks in the soil, covering what had once been chaos. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel outnumbered. The land had remembered who it belonged to, and that was enough.